Good morning and welcome to this week's recruitment discussion with Jump. And this week we're hitting the retained revolution. Moving your agency from contingency to potentially exclusive and to retained business and working from there. Remember, if you're watching on YouTube, please do follow the channel. It'd be much greated. And as always, there are some stats to go with this week's webinar to work it out. And I spent a lot of time looking at things out there. So the difference between contingency, retained and exclusive models. And here you go. Here's some metrics for you. Success rate, fill rates. Contingency between 20 and 30%, which we do know. Retained between 90 and 98%. Couldn't find anything for exclusive models. Retention of your clients. Contingency, on average per year, you retain 70% of your clients. On retained, 95%. And on exclusive, again, we couldn't quite get details for that. Typical fees. Here's an interesting one. Typical fee on contingency model is 15 to 20%. On retained is 25 to 33%, but often that's similar to contingency depending on what market you're in. And surprisingly, on exclusive, it's between 15 and 25%. Key differentiations in the model: fill rate disparity. Contingency are juggling usually between 10 to 20 roles at once, and it's a race for a CV, where search is usually, or retained, is looking at 3 to 8 roles, and they have almost 100% fill rate on those roles. Candidate quality: retained focus on market mapping their passive candidates, where contingency is all about reactive marketplaces, and obviously exclusive falls in between that. Business efficiency, as we've said, 30% fill rate, which means 7 out of 10 jobs go unfilled. So it's a bit of a lottery. But one of the key metrics that came up, the overall slowdown, is that employers take nearly twice as long to fill a job than they did compared in 2020, at the beginning of 2024. So if you think the clients are tightening up their process and they're taking twice as long to fill a job, should we not be thinking about creating a service offering that encompasses that, especially when we're talking to new employment, with the new employment rights, and we're looking at the new acts that are coming and things like that. So I think there's an awful lot going on in the marketplace that we are looking at. So Dave, as usual, is here with us to help us sort of navigate through this week's topic. As always, I've created a audit. So if you want to audit your contingency business to see whether if you've got the right stepping stones to go to exclusive or to retain, then drop us a note in the message box, and I'll get that across to you, or send me an email at info@jumpadvisory.com and I'll get one across to you. So Dave, first question. Give us what happens when an agency shifts even 20% of their revenue from contingency to exclusive or retained, and what actually happens to their margins, their conversion rates, and the quality of their client relationships?
Yeah, morning, everyone. In some respects, Ad, you've answered that question by giving us those stats, because that's absolutely true in all the businesses that I've ever worked with. The ones that have got the retained model right, or even the exclusive model right, have seen a buoyancy. They've seen an uptick in their margins, and they've seen an uptick in client satisfaction. Because although we know the market is more challenging in certain areas, as we've said over the last few weeks in this series, there's still a shortage of good candidates across the board, whether you're in hospitality, whether you're in the high-end space and engineering, there's still a shortage. So if you can get the right candidates and be paid appropriately for it, as in some of your businesses retained, you're going to be in a stronger position. The two key areas for me: one, it makes commercial sense, as you just said, to have a percentage of your business retained by asking the right questions, by delivering the right service. But it also adds to the value of your business. So at the moment, PE ratios, depending on what price earnings ratios, depending on what market you're in, we know it's challenging times, but they're three or four, maybe up to five for good contracts like perm recruiters. But if you have got that annuity of strong retained and long-term contracts with organizations, you could add a point or two on that. And a point or two on that, depending on what your EBIT number is, makes your business significantly more value. So even if you could only do that for 20% of your business, you're going to get a bigger value percentage. over the longer term.
It's interesting, isn't it? I remember doing this in my own business, and I remember some of my consultants openly moaning about, oh, it's so difficult to sell, it's so difficult to do this, etc., etc. I remember one of the first retainers that we actually sold, and the guy that sold it walked up to the board and chalked up on the board, chalked up, I think it was 17.5 grand. And so, what is that a deal? He went, no, that's the first part of a retainer. And they went, what, 17.5 grand? They said, yeah, that's a third of the retainer. 2 days later, he put his CVs across, got his CVs out for interview, put another 17.5 grand up. And you could suddenly see the ripple effect across the office, that people suddenly realised that here's a guy that's chalking up deals that's twice as big as, or 3 times as big as the average deal that we were doing at the time, because I brought him in to do that and I wanted to change the way the business was going.
Yeah.
And the team suddenly started to understand their value. And it was their value on the investment in time to the results that they were getting. And over a very short period of time, what I started to see was the poorer clients that we were working with, the clients that would mess us around, the clients that were awfully slow at feeding back on CVs, that always wanted, oh, I like that CV, but they've come 3 weeks later. And now that candidate wasn't available and they had to start to redo the job again. We started to stop working with those clients. So I started to see a massive change in the consultants. So when we start to talk about what happens with the margin, the conversion rates, and the client relationships, what I started to see was the consultants understanding that this wasn't just about driving a KPI board just to get as many jobs as they could on. This was about driving quality and therefore investing their time, and they would make more money, which they all started to do. And that's what happened. So margins went up, conversion rates went up, and our client relationships improved. But it all started with the consultants understanding that once you started to sell at that level, and it didn't matter what the size of the job was. We weren't saying over 100K or over 50K. We were saying at any job within that marketplace that we're working at that you could go for. We start to see significant change in the way that we dealt with clients, dealt with candidates, and that increased our margin, our conversion rate, and improved our client relationships at no end. So I think it's about that ripple effect and understanding that if you can get it and understand what you're selling, it has a massive effect on your business, as you've said, regarding from a PE point of view, but internally in your business, people have a different viewpoint of it. We do this an awful lot. Now, I put this question in just to sort of challenging ourselves really, but also to look at things. So if we were sat with a recruitment leader and looking at their client list right now, how do you identify who gets the exclusive conversion or conversation first, and what tells you a client is ready or already primed for that move before you've even picked up the phone?
I think it's easier to start, and this is an obvious statement, but it's easier to start with the clients with whom you have the strongest relationship, because there's trust already built there, and you get that conversation of why should I pay you for something that you do anyway? Yeah, and we'll come back on to that later. But so you've got to get over that mini hurdle, and it is only a mini hurdle, and look at, well, actually, the roles that you want us to work on, are they roles that really significantly matter for you to the client? And that's the sort of conversation to have. And this is why you should use our business, my business, whatever it is, to go retain. This is what you get from it. And often it's the fact that we don't even ask, that we don't even enter into the conversation. And the first question said, what about 20%? Well, what if just 1/5 of your business was retained business? It would transform your business. So you look at your client list and go, right, who are the people I can have these conversations with? This is the service we're going to provide you. These are the people that are going to do it for you. And this is why it matters to you. And particularly when clients are hiring at a leadership level. So look at your clients and work out which of those clients are hiring at a leadership level. Because a bad hire at a leadership level costs significantly more than a 15% fee or 20% fee or whatever you get if it's on the permanent side, and even if it's a long-term contract or an interim contract. Yeah, that costs significant amount of money. So where are your clients hiring at a more senior level? Because often that's a good place to start to justify and say, actually, we provide a new or different retained service, and this is what it's for, and this is why you should do it. So look at the client base, who have you got good relationships with, and who are the ones that are maybe hiring at a senior level for a senior team, or have got a new management team or a new structure, and start the conversation there.
So without sort of regurgitating that, I'd want to listen to what how my consultants describe their relationship with their clients. So I want to listen
Yeah,
to what they're saying, but what's more important to me is what they're not saying. And I think sometimes when I went through this, I think like dogs can sense fears, can't they? They can smell fear. So if you're describing the innovation that you want to take place with your top clients, and you're taking that client on a journey from contingency to retained or anything in between, but you see that fear in your consultant's eyes, you hear it in their voice, then you've got two questions to answer, haven't you? Is your consultant skilled enough? Therefore, what training do they need? And is your client relations strong enough to go and sell that too? And I think
yeah.
until I understand those two things, I never had my people, pitching this to a client, because it tended to ruin the relationship we will talk about later on. So if it's not strong enough in my experience, it's about building your own business and guiding your own people in your business to be able to sell. Because if we haven't got the right relationship, then we've got to start to build that relationship, and it takes time to build that relationship. So the clients that primed to me was, I'd be looking at the data and your understanding of the client relationship, and that should tell you when you're ready to view that point. Okay. We talked about last week, we talked about business development, about being treated as business as usual. I think when you're starting to build a new product and you're selling a new product, it should be a project, and therefore should be looking at the risks evaluated to it. So
Yeah,
look at the risks on, are your margins dropping? So therefore, there's a risk in lower GP. Have you got lots of competition in those clients? Therefore, you've got a risk of losing that client if someone comes in with a more industry solution than you have. But what's the upside of not selling? What's the risk of not selling? Losing that, etc. So I'd have that risk assessment done of what's going on, and then I'd take your client base and your consultants on a journey of excellence. What does excellence look like on delivery? What does honesty look like about building a relationship where both parties see the opportunity as a prospect, not a client then seeing it as a problem? And I think that's the bit you've got to educate your client to get there. And so when you look at either side of the coin, are they ready? Are they not? You have to work both sides. And I knew that, when I was building deep relationships by excellence, delivery, and being brutally honest with my client and with my consultants, that became a game changer. Because I think too many consultants think they've got a really in-depth relationship with their client when all they've got is a transactional relationship. And then they go and try and sell a really prime service, and the client laughs at them because they don't believe that they can deliver that, because they haven't built that equity up in the bank with the client and working from there. So I think it's time that we started to look at that. So when I start to identify the clients, I've got to see whether they're ready to go to that point, but also is the consultant ready to take them to that point. And I think that's the most important thing that I discovered when I went through that process.
yeah, yeah.
Here's another different type of question then. Most recruiters pitch exclusivity or retained by leading with what they need: security, upfront fees. What should they be leading with instead? And how do you reframe that entire conversation so a client sees exclusivity as something that protects their hire, not their revenue?
I think if you lead with what you need as a business, it doesn't matter whether you're selling retained or contingency or any service, your chances of success are significantly less, and we know that because we've all done it, we've all tried that, we've all made those mistakes. With retained business, absolutely, you must start with what are the pain points of the client. Is it retention of staff? Is it leadership style? Is it culture? Is it you could use the data you've got within your databases or on LinkedIn to show them how many people leave and where they go. Again, use the data that is available to you as a consultant, as a team leader. go to the client and say, well, we're aware of this is what's going on in your business. You've got an issue here. Can we talk about it? And then the solution to that is, well, let us go and get you some of the very best people who are around, who aren't looking for work. So they're passive candidates that we can pull out because we know that these people will fit into your culture. And that takes a while. To add on to your previous answer, you do need to train your staff. If you're a really good contingent recruiter, that doesn't just mean you can go and sell a service like a retained service. You've got to be trained, you've got to understand, you've got to role play and understand it from the client's point of view, because they want access to candidates. They absolutely want confidentiality. So they need to know that if you're suddenly upselling and now you're selling a retained service, how confidential is that? Is it confidential in your database? Are you going to be calling people that everybody else is going to have access to? There's things you've got to think about as well. So you need to understand what are the challenges the client face and the answer to those challenges. If it's retained, then you could sell and start to begin and have a conversation about retained business. Because remember, you're asking for money up front to do the job that you should be paid for, but traditionally you haven't because you've done contingent recruitment.
So when I did this with my own agency and when I did this with other businesses, or I've done this with other businesses, I start with data. And I start apps with data, and it's data about past performance. Your data should show you how your service needs to improve and the things that you are trying to sell or lead with. And that will give you the feature that you can then present to the client. But what we tend to see is when I do that with clients, they see the feature and they go and sell the feature. What they don't sell is the advantage and the benefits of what that data is telling them. And so it's about the service of the future, and it's about the features and the benefits of that, from there. So how you look at CV to interview, requirement to offer, the usual ones, time to fill. However, the one that I started to really use that had the biggest conversion rate was what's the economic worth of the candidate. So you look at candidate retention. So has that candidate made it past the first 6 months, first 12 months, first 18 months, first 24 months, because that's where you start to generate massed amount of wealth for your client. But very few agencies measure that or see that. And that, when you think about, and when I ask this question quite a lot to recruiters, when does the recruitment process start and finish? It starts when the client gives you a job and it finishes when you've placed the candidate or it's past the rebate period. And the answer is no, it's not. It's when you have knowledge of the client, to capitalize what you're talking about, so you can build a candidate pool for them. And it finishes when your candidate leaves or exits the business. That's the whole worth of recruitment. So if you look at that and you then start to mine that knowledge, your candidate knowledge, your competitor knowledge, your industry knowledge, your market knowledge, then data now is what they keep saying is the new oil. So we need to stop using it in a poor way. And so again, we're back to features, advantages, and benefits, knowing all of those things and helping them. And there's a person on the webinar today, which is interesting. She made a placement of a high-end CFO for a client. The client loved the process, retained process, loved it, came back to her and said, I want 2 low-level people to go into the business to do some work. Didn't know whether to go for retained, didn't know whether to go to contingency, thought of dropping her rates from a normal 15, but she'd done the retained at 25. That role was normally 15, but wanted the job. So we thought about dropping it to 10. No, let's work out what those roles would actually work for the client, getting 2 good people into those business. What was it worth to the client? And when we worked it out, it was significantly more than the CFO was worth to the client because the amount of work that they produced.
Right.
Guess what? Went and sold a retainer. Guess what? Won the retainer because all of a sudden they could see the worth of bringing the right candidate to them and what's going on from there. So I have another client who has, figures in 6 figures is their average fee. sometimes go to 7 figures as an average fee. They talk about the worth of their client, but what they're doing is they're uploading their payment structure. So you get a small payment at the start when you place the person, but based on performance, you get a bigger payment and a bigger payment for the next 2 years. So they have a very different way of looking at it, but that's all based on data that they have and data that they do. So I think when you're pitching, you have to see what it's worth to the client. It's not just about putting a bum on a seat. Putting the right bum on the seat, having the right bum stay there for an awful long time, and make the client valuable money. And that's the thing that we start to lead with, and that's what clients understand. You're right. They want candidates, but they want candidates who stay because they generate the money. And that one stat is very simple that came through was that on average, it takes 12 months for any employee at any level to start to make the company money if they're in a position of a money-making or value position. It takes them 12 months. So getting them past that first 12 months is really important. Here's one of the most sort of things that recruiters never think about. Temp and contract on an exclusive or retained basis. So what does that actually look like in practice? And how do you structure that conversation with a client who's used to calling 3 or 4 agencies because they need a temp and a contractor immediately? And what does the fee and margin arrangement look like when you own a relationship exclusively?
Well, I've seen it in a couple of ways. I've seen it where an organisation is providing temp workers or contractors and has offered to find them for the client on an exclusive basis. And for guarantee, they've reduced their fee. So their fee went from 17% to 14%. But it meant that all of the requirements they were working on, they were filling. And they signed the client up to a 12-month contract. And I've even seen one which is a 24-month contract, which is unusual. But it's having the nous and the intelligence to ask the question and saying to the client, if I do this for you, this is what it means for you. You don't have to spend as much time interviewing because I found you all the right candidates. I can show you my market mapping. I can show you where I'm going to get the candidates from. And I can show you how I've had those conversations and why these people will stay. And if you've got any evidence or proof that you can deliver to a new prospect, say, they may already be a client, but for this service, they're a prospect, then you can convince them because it makes business sense for them and you to work on an exclusive basis. I think people do assume when we're talking retained, we're talking permanent. Because that's obviously the background, but I've seen it done many, many times. For senior roles, I once asked without knowing I'd done it. I was fairly new at the recruitment game, and I said, "Can I just do that on my own?" And they said, "What do you mean?" And I didn't even use the right language. He said, "Well, give it to me. Give me 72 hours, and I'll fill you the job, but you don't go to anybody else." Now, we would all say that that's the approach that every consultant should take. But remember, most consultants are still quite new to our industry. They're not old and wise like we are, or old and stupid like we are. They're new to it. So they don't know. They only know what they know. And if they've not been trained that way, and they've not been trained to ask for exclusivity, then they won't ask for it. But clients want the easiest possible life. And if you can show them that actually going the retained way on contract or permanent gives them the best choice, because that's always the worry. Well, if I only go with you, am I going to get the best candidates? Well, yeah, this is how retain works. This is what we do for you. We've got a defined process. We've got access to passive candidates. We are absolutely confidential in our approach. This is why you should do it. But one client that we both work with got 10 of its clients sign up to its own PSL. Candidate market's tough. We're going to sign you to our PSL. Be one of our top 10.
I remember having this conversation in my own at CP about taking clients on a journey and what's going on. And to me, it was about the education of the client, but also understanding what staff they needed. Now, obviously, we know contract and temp, it is a really fast moving market. And so understanding your candidate's worth is really important. And going to sell exclusivity, you've got to show the benefit to the client of exclusivity. And to me, that was all about what it looked at. And we christened the project, because we used it as a project, Good, the Bad, the Ugly. But it wasn't about the client. It was about the consultant's understanding of the client. Did you have a really good understanding of the client and its marketplace? Did you have a bad understanding of the client and the marketplace? Or did you have a really ugly understanding of the client and the marketplace? And it was really interesting when we started to take the candidates, the consultants through that process. Right, there's your best client. Right now, give me 10 candidates that you could drop into a job straight away. Oh, I can't. Right, so that's not a good client. That's a bad or an ugly client. And we started to then provide the clients in that way based on what the consultant knew about the client. Once we started to get clients where we had consultants had a good understanding of the client, good understanding of what they needed, and had a good database that they could fill the job, then we went to start to sell exclusivity to those clients. Then we started to sell retained things to those clients. And it was about that understanding of what does the client want from an agency? And the client initially isn't bothered about your service. They're not bothered about how many CVs they get. They want to know that they get a good quality candidate. And that's what good looks like for them. So it doesn't matter whether it's a cheap margin, an ugly margin, or a bad service, etc. The data will show you where ugly clients and your bad clients are. And I'll give an idea of in lockdown, we had a client up in Scotland who had one major client, and a new FD came in. First thing was they had about 40 to 50 temps on there exclusively. And this client working really, really well. Instantly, the FD rang her up and said, your margin needs to half. In fact, if you don't half your margin, then that's it. I'm not working with you. So she rang me and said, what should I do? So I said, right, okay, let's have a look at your contract. So I went through a contract, said, right, you do realize that in your contract, they can't use the same contractors again for another 6 months unless they come through you. Do you think you've got all the best candidates in the marketplace? Absolutely have. Absolutely. Right, okay. Say no. But what do you mean that's most of my revenue? Say no. So you're going to lose some months' revenue, but you're going to lose it anyway because he's going to half your revenue and you're not going to make any money. We've worked out the calculation on the half of the margin. You make zero money, so you've got no problem. You've got no risk here whatsoever. So she did. She stopped, and then told the client that's what she was going to do. And so the client said, "Fine," brought a new agency in. They couldn't fill the jobs. The client ended up coming back to her and cap in hand saying, I need you to come back, or my managers want you to come back. We've got some really poor staff. We're losing productivity. We're losing this. We're losing that. We're losing the other, etc. My MD has suddenly found out this is what I've done and gone berserk. What can I do? Can we come back at the same margin at 15%? And I told her to say no. Go back in at 17. And they agreed at 16.5 based on the quality of what the company was doing, but also she signed another 2-year agreement for exclusivity.
Yeah, good point.
Based on quality.
Yeah.
Here's a question then. Walk us through what a retained or exclusive proposal actually looks like when you're committing to milestones. What does the client get at each stage, and how do you make the deliverables feel so compelling that the fee becomes the easiest part of the conversion? Why don't we sort of go through where the first point, we'll both go through the first point, etc. I think the first point is engagement. So you talk to me what you think about engagement.
Well, the engagement for me is you show as the consultant that you know the type of person the client's looking for, that you know your market. So you're looking for an engineer, for example, it's now on a retained basis. You've got to demonstrate that you know the type of person you're looking for. You can't just be a very good consultant. You have to show that you know the market. And often that will be in the proposal. So when you're working on a contingent basis, how do you take the requirement and off you go and you work in it? And if your stats are absolutely correct, and I think they are, you're looking at between 19 and 30%, you're going to fill it. 1 in 3, 1 in 4, maybe 1 in 5. Yeah. This one, you know you have to fill. So you better know your market. You better know who's moving. You better know who the movers and shakers are in terms of the clients, potentially the candidates. So you have to demonstrate that in the first part of that proposal. This engagement is different because this is the market, this is the field we're going to look for candidates in, and that demonstrates that you know what's going on. The second bit is show them your processes.
Before we go into that, I'm going to add to that engagement part to work on engagement. Okay, because we're going to work on recruitment delivery next. Okay, know your market is really important. Know your candidate market is really important. Okay, but I also think being very honest to your client is very important. Looking at the candidate market, there are lots of candidates in this market that we can approach, that we've approached, that we have in our database, that we've talked to, etc., etc. So we think we can find that. Looking at the roles that you've got, there are very few candidates in the market. So therefore, this is a retained search that will take quite a bit of time. And I'll go back to that client in London, 6-7 figures. They have retains where they're telling clients it might take us 18 months to find this person. So they've been very honest about the capability of the marketplace to supply the client as well, not just the recruitment agency. Where I think on contingent, we're just happy to say, yeah, I'll take the job. Let me go away and find it. I'll come you back. Yeah, when I've got CVs. So it's been really open and honest. And I think that part of that engagement process is being that honest and brutal about this is what the market actually looks like. So your data and your information about the market is really important. And that's where the big ticket players in the headhunting market, that's why they're charging 35, 40%, because they don't know the market inside out and what's happening. If you look at the next part then about your recruitment services and your delivery, talk about what you look at recruitment services and delivery.
Well, you should have, if you are offering a retained service, you should have a process. And it's a process that you should share with your client. These are the type of people we're going to speak to. These are the type of references we're going to get. These are the type of one-to-one meetings we will have. If you're using search, if you're doing search and retained, use a different language. Don't use the language of a recruiter. We're going to interview 5 people. Don't say that. Say we're going to have a meeting with 5 people, because it's an elevated service. And it's part of the reason why there is a mystique around search. It's a part of the reason why the big 5 have such an ability to control the dynamic and charge higher fees, because the way they approach it is very different to the way recruiters approach it. So you need to have your search, your process written down so you know what you're doing and be able to articulate that to the client. It can take 18 months, and you're absolutely right about the honesty, but I'm the chair of a search firm, and over 25 mandates, don't call them requirements, over 25 mandates, we were able to outline the right person that the client said yes to, on average in 47 days. So it's about 6 or 7 weeks, something like that. Yeah. Didn't mean that the person then took the job, because they're obviously, most of them are on notice. It's very rare you get an available candidate. But if you could show that and have a conversation with the client about that, that's a very impressive step. Now, it also depends on the market, depends on what's going on. But as long as you can show them your processes, most clients in contingent don't think we have processes. They just think we go to a database and out pops the CV. Still today. Yeah. So show them the process that you have. What makes it different to maybe a contingent process? Yeah, but you're not working on 10 of these at any one time. You're working on 1 or 2.
I think it's interesting, that comment. Again, when the clients that I've worked with to do retained, I've said, right, okay, let's look at how people buy products today. People buy products in, you buy a service in various different ways. Here's a free service. Look at anything you buy on a SaaS product. Here's a free service. So you get the very smallest version of that. Here's a paid version. You now get the free service plus all this paid version. Yeah. Here is the next version up, and here's the supercharged version. Surely we should be thinking about doing that in recruitment. Here's the contingent version. Here's an exclusive version. Here's a retained version. Here's a product that we've built for you, etc., etc. But here are all the processes that we go through. This is what we actually do. This is all you're getting, etc., etc. So your market knowledge, your interview knowledge. Are you interviewing people over the phone? Are you interviewing people face to face? I remember getting called by headhunters when I was at Deco. They weren't calling from resources. They were researchers. They were researching the market and getting market information from me, and whether or not I would move, what I would move for, etc. So all the time they have a different terminology but it says the same thing. They're doing something similar. But the other thing that they do, and this is the bit I've got lots of my clients starting to do as well, at the end of every week, they will send the client a breakdown of what they have done.
Yeah, that's
Who,
part of that should be part of the process.
yeah, who they've spoken to, what they've spoken to them about, okay, why they would leave, why they would stay, what the average salary, etc., etc. So much data so they can see what you actually do. And it's really interesting when you speak to a client and say, right, hey, here's my long list of 500 candidates that are right in your marketplace. I've done that down to a shorter list of 50 that we're now going to interview. We've interviewed 48 of those 50, of which we think 10 are right. We've put 10 through a process. Here are the 3 CVs that we think you should see. That's a whole different conversation to what recruitment does. So what would you then, if you're then moving down that process, I had the next process as interview, what would the next process that you would talk people through?
Well, it would be meetings. It would be you'd show how you conduct those meetings and how you get to that shortlist. Ideally, most clients, in my experience, want to see at least 2 candidates, sometimes 3. But sometimes, if the trust is there, they'll accept the one that you found. And go back to my previous answer about leadership. If you're looking for leaders, you're looking for a CEO or a CFO, there may not be 2 ideal candidates. There may just be one. And the client also may know where that one resides, but needs you to go and convince them to come out because they can't do it themselves. So you're doing a lot of great work for that client, and there may only be one candidate. But ideally, you want to give them the option of 2, and you attach notes, interview notes. As part of your process, so the candidate can see your thinking and understand why you've chosen those 2.
So I do exactly the same. It's about showing all the detail. And I think it's about doing the maths exam. Show your workings, you know, develop
Yes.
your workings and show your workings from there, because I think that's really important. But then it's quantifying how that candidate matches. And I think that is a scale that works with whether you're offering. And I think a lot of people in the contingency market just polish their contingency service and then try to apply that. That never works. You have to have a completely different service or an upgrade to your service that looks at so psychometric testing, etc. But becomes part of those sort of things. And it's how you do that. That helps to go through the next stage, which is the offer stage. And the offer stage, I think, is the most important stage that you go through in this process, because at this stage, you shouldn't have, at the moment, there's a reasonable number of dropouts that are coming through, and we'll talk about dropouts later, but there's a reasonable number of dropouts. So we should think about that offer stage and how that is dealt with, because I always think the offer stage is the most important stage. And I would always recommend, where you can, to do the offer face-to-face with the candidate.
Absolutely. I mean, the work that I do with our search firm, 82% of the work we do is abroad. So it isn't face to face. You often can't get to face to face. But if you're operating exclusively in the search mode, you're getting to know the candidates as well. You're seeing them at events. Yeah, so you are traveling. I mean, our expenses for the search firm, we attend events all over the world because we want to be seen to be mixing and mingling with the senior candidates in that world. So that also our brand, people know to come to us when they're looking for senior people. So if you can do the offer face to face, of course, that's what you should do. But sometimes if it's a global role, you can't always do that. But the offer certainly should be, the candidate certainly should be pre-closed. If we can get you this amount, this package, will you take the job? Yes, right, let's go.
So I just think it should be a case that you should never be offering a candidate anyway, unless you know they're going to accept.
Yeah,
and that's part of that. And that's part of that pre-start sort of mechanism as well, process. Because I always think that the next stage, and this is where people are very poor, the next stage that candidate's going to go through is the next interview. But that's not an interview that we're holding. It's an interview that they're having with their own client when they're resigning. To me, I class that as an interview. So I'm going to prep my candidate on how they go through that interview. And prepping that candidate means that you should have 0 dropout, because you've got the right person going through to the right job with the right reasons, and therefore there should be no reason for them to be counter offered or to accept a counter offer. And it's understanding that. And again, I remember going through that process in my own business. In 18 months, we had one dropout. And the person that dropped out got offered the job, stayed at the job for 6 months, and then left. But what we caused the client the problem where we put two candidates forward. Both candidates were brilliant. One did the job that we originally, they said, we're going to take this candidate to do the other job. And we said, have you profiled him against that job? And they said, no, it's all right. We don't have to. He loves it. He left 6 months later because he didn't like the job. Loved the company, but didn't like the job. So I think that profiling both at offer stage and then taking them through that pre-start stage is really important. Let's move on to the question then, because I think the hardest part of converting buyers, lapsed new or new clients to retained, are the objections that they get when they're used to getting everything that's free. And we get lots of objections. So if a long-standing client, sort of 3-year contingency placements with them, looked you in the eye and said, I trust you, but I'm not paying for anything up front for something I don't know will work, how do you normally overcome that objection?
Partly that's about recognizing you're not going to win everyone, but you have to show that there is a value to the client of engaging in a retained or exclusive relationship with you. So you're having the conversation with the client because you've done excellent service. Because the work you've done is free, you're having the conversation. But ask the client, what do they expect to get for free in the way that they buy? And if I can demonstrate that working on a retained basis, the candidates will stay longer, they're of a better quality, then why shouldn't you pay? And it comes back to that trust element. If the client trusts you and knows you've delivered an excellent service, and what you're saying is, I'm going to accelerate your hiring profile because working with me on an exclusive basis, I'm not working on other things. I'm working totally to you. The time to hire is going to be less. The quality of candidate is going to be better. You're not going to have to interview for lots of different people. You've got a set price. It's an intelligent conversation that can lead to maybe an exclusive or retained win for you. But you've got to have all that listed down and understand from the client's point of view why it makes a difference. Some clients will accept it, some clients won't. But unless you ask and you're trained to ask, you won't get it at all.
So I think it's important to understand their why. And I think what we generally do when we get an objection, we tend to try overcome the objection, or if it's a false objection, we just ignore it. When actually, this is probably the first real big objection that we're going to get. Understanding their why. Could it be that they're worried? Could it be that it's not their budget? Could it be that there's something outside the business norm that says that it's risky? Could it be that they haven't got the authority to buy at this level, but they're feel a little bit belittled by that, by you asking them and things like that, So I've come across loads of reasons, and I've always had to dig deeper. And I remember these objections really clearly when I found that the initial objection was normally about, I get this for free. Why should I go to you exclusively? Why should I do this retained, etc.? And usually it was because there was no data, and we had to change it from being a promise to an actual delivery. So one thing that we spoke about was our service and how our service worked. But what we never spoke to our clients about was a rebate period. Why? Because 3 months was the norm, and most clients were happy with that. So we thought we'd have to concede on rebate periods. But what we started to do was start to understand the placement in our business that was doing. And we started to understand the amount of people that went beyond 12 months. And we were averaging, well, first of all, I started to do that from a global proposition, and it was 94% people on retained, who've gone through the retained service, 94% of them stay over a year. Contingency is 70%. I also discovered when I looked at my own data, we were at 93% of people that we placed stayed a year. So what we started to change was we started to put our money where our mouth was. So we back our business by saying 3-month retainer. This is how confident we are of our services, what we're doing with our services. So our 3-month return became 6, became 9, it became 12. And you start to think most people were fearing about 12, but if you start to think about the average recruitment consultant, okay, places 2 heads per month, that's 24 heads per year. At 93%, that's 22.3 out of your 24 heads that will still be there after a year. So basically what you're talking about is 1 and a bit person. You think about contingency at 70%, 24 placements, 70% is 16.8. That's 7 heads that you lose.
Yep.
Now you think about that. You then start to talk about a client about you're working on contingency. So that everybody you take on from contingency, you're going to lose 30% of those people. That is a massive amount that they're going to disappear. You talk about retained, and we talk about getting through that first 12 months, 93% will get through that first 12 months. That is a huge financial benefit to the client that very few recruiters ever talk about. And I think that's the bit that we started to dig into, and that's the bit that started to change our course of action with our clients, when we could start to understand what our true success rate looked like, and we could articulate that properly to the client. And they started to work from there. So last question, very quickly then. What's the single thing a recruitment leader must never do when a client pushes back on an exclusive or retained deal? You know, the response that sort of kills the deal, destroys the positioning, you know, sending them straight back to sort of competing contingency. What should you never do?
Never sound like a contingency recruiter that's trying to upsell. If you believe in your service as a retained consultant and the client doesn't believe in it, that's okay. You can still provide a contingent service, but it probably will be other people. Yeah, because if you're actually going to build a retained business and you're going to choose certain people to build it, and they're only going to sell retained, believe me, if they're only selling retained, that's all they do. Yeah, so at our firm, nobody does contingent recruitment. It's not an either or. Yeah? We've trained our people specifically to sell retained because they attract better clients, they get predictable revenue. You know, it signals the positioning of the business. We are a retained business. Now, if you offer retained and contingent, then you can offer retained, and you know you can still supply. But it's no good getting cross at the client. The big thing is retained work treats you as a professional. Contingent work treats you as a vendor, and you as an owner have to decide, well, what do you want? And you may want a bit of both, that's fine. You may just want one, you may just want the other. But you have to decide, where does retained and exclusive fit into your strategy for your business growth, and what you're going to do about that.
It was interesting when I went through this process, and I've gone through this with quite a number of clients. The first thing I said to them was, what you can't afford to do when pitching retained and delivering retained is lie to your client. And they all sort of said, well, we never lied to our client. I said, oh, let's really be honest. How many people have got honesty, you know, integrity written on their, you know, on their websites as part of their key attributes of their business, etc. And I said, how often do you take a job where you know you're never going to fill a job? How often do you take a position where you know you haven't got candidates? How often do you drop a position because you've worked it for a couple of days, you don't think you're going to finish it, etc., etc.? That happens all the time. But we never actually go back and have that conversation with the client. So I think the fear from the client's point of view of that conversion from contingency to retained or exclusive is measured by how honest you are about your performance and what you're doing. And so I think the second thing is, what I tell them to do is, you are selling a premier service where most people take exclusive and retained. And there are reasons why you would drop your price, but usually you shouldn't. But you shouldn't immediately drop your price just because you've got it exclusive. You're giving a better service. Retained, you're giving them a higher service. Therefore, you should have a walk away point. If it doesn't feel right, walk away. And dropping your price isn't the right thing to do. And that's what most recruitment leaders do when they get something that's retained or exclusive. They drop their price rather than up their price. And I think it's about them understanding their value of what's going on. So first of all, don't lie to your client. And secondly, don't drop your price. That's the things I tell them. Ladies and gents, thanks so much for your time. Much appreciated, Dave. Thanks for your input, as always appreciated. Next week, we're talking AI and how AI can enable your process, whether it be contingency, whether it be retained, etc., etc. So we're going to have a real dig into AI and what AI can do for you. So, ladies and gents, thanks for your time. Look forward to hearing from you next week, and look forward to seeing you all, Dave, next week. Well, Dave, you're in Ireland, but we've got a AI expert on next week who will help us with all of this. Ladies and gents, thanks for your time. Much appreciated.
Take care, everybody.